You are listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.
Welcome to this episode of CEO Perspectives, a new podcast series by the Conference Board. CEO Perspectives are conversations that take an objective, data-driven look at a range of timely topics that matter most to business executives. To help make sense of these topics and how they'll unfold, we'll sit down with thought leaders and do what we do best at the Conference Board, provide insights for what's ahead. I'm Steve Odland, the CEO of the Conference Board and the host of this podcast series, and today's conversation will focus on the U.S. supply chain and where is our stuff? What's driving the current shortages? How are top retailers responding, and what can we expect? And I'm very happy to introduce our guest today, Cathy Leonhardt, the Managing Director and Co-Head of Solomon Partners Global Consumer Retail Group. Cathy, welcome.
Thank you, Steve, for having me join.
Yeah, and Cathy, you're an expert on supply chain because you deal with all of these retail clients, and you've had conversations, every day with your clients on what's going on and so forth. But first of all, our listeners may not know what exactly we mean by the supply chain, but essentially it's from the point of manufacture to the point of consumption, right? So, talk about, your definition, and then maybe you can give us an overview of the issues that the U.S. supply chain is seeing today.
I think a lot of clients define it as factory to warehouse, and that's been the most common way you look at it. I think as we step back and see what's going on today, it's much broader than that, given the issues we're facing. And, stepping back, the supply chain disruption is global. It's widespread. It's multifaceted. It's Asia. It's Southeast Asia. It's China, Pakistan, Brazil. So it's impacting all regions of the world. And, interestingly, it covers nearly all categories and raw materials. We like to say from thread to chip.
Yeah, and that's product supply chain, but service supply chain is having trouble too, in the sense that they don't have enough labor, they're not getting enough ingredients for stores, yada yada yada. So, I mean, these supply chain issues are all over.
It's fair. I mean, I think when we look at what's happened, you've seen pent up consumer demand, as you said, raw material shortage. You've had country of origin issues. You've had COVID shutdowns. You've had employee shortages, and you see in the trucking shortages, and all of this is creating massive delays in the system. And when you step back, you talk about U.S. supply chain. In the U.S., we're an importing country, and what we are seeing is certainly unprecedented.
Yeah, importing meaning, we don't produce a lot of stuff here anymore. And, at one time we moved our supply chain or our manufacturing over because, labor was cheaper elsewhere. And you could afford to, with the labor savings, to pay for all of that transportation. But that's flipping, isn't it?
It is, but you still have major product categories that are heavily dependent on certain countries and regions. And, you look at businesses like footwear, Nike, Under Armour, highly publicized manufacturing delays from these lockdowns in Vietnam and Indonesia, because that's where the shoes are produced. And they haven't, the supply chain is not diversified enough. So I think Nike came out and talked about they lost 10 weeks of production since July because of the factory shutdowns due to COVID.
Yeah. And, I read recently that there isn't one shoe made in America today. I don't know if that's the case, because somebody could go produce one and prove me wrong. But I mean, we don't produce shoes here. And there's so much, you go right down the list. We don't produce clothes. We don't produce shoes. I don't know. What are you going to do?
You're very dependent. There's not a lot you can do, and it takes a long time to shift the supply chain. We're starting to see more agility in the supply chains to address this, but it's going to take a while. I mean, we're going to be at this for a while.
Yeah, and people say, well, why don't you just move the factories back to the U.S.? Moving a factory is kind of hard, isn't it? And it's a little expensive.
It's hard, and it's still much more expensive than anyone can ever fathom.
Yeah. Now, part of the issue is that, this stuff is on the water a long time. So you talked about factories being shut down, overseas due to COVID, but then there's also the shortage of ships, the shortage of containers. Talk about that whole, the boat thing, the stuff that comes across on the water.
We saw shipments begin to accelerate as COVID conditions improved. And what you started to see was clogging in the ports. I love the word clogging, and the warehouses. And you had a couple of things going on. You had shortage of labor, but as this volume started coming through, you didn't have enough containers, you didn't have enough container chassis to move the goods, and you didn't have enough drivers to take the goods and move them out of the port into warehouses. So a lot of complexity. And, I think to give you a sense of this delay, and we are talking massive delays. One client told me, it used to be maybe 2 days to unload the container and get it out. Now they're saying it's 15 days. Another client said it's 17 to 19 days to turn the vessel. And by the way, they sent me a note this morning and said some good news. It's turning rather quickly. We saw 16 days turns down from 19 days.
Oh my word. And the warehouses on the coast and the port are full. And I hear they've got no place to put these empty containers, and they aren't sending them back on ships because we don't export anything, as you said. And so they're parking these containers on neighborhood streets around the ports.
It is quite a lot of congestion. I mean, you talk about how many ships are waiting to get in Port of Los Angeles and Long Beach. They're sort of combined. And I heard this yesterday. There are still 100 vessels waiting to get in, and typically that's like 2.
Yeah, 100 vessels, and I don't know if our listeners have seen these vessels, but they are just stacked massively high with these huge containers. So unloading one of these babies is it is not a 1-hour job.
Yeah, I mean, if you've been to Southern California, it extends from Santa Barbara to San Diego.
Yeah. 40% of all our, seaborne imports come through that port. So that is a really important one, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
It certainly is. The other thing is China can't get the goods out fast enough. And our clients are seeing the factories in China rent warehouses to hold the goods until they can get a ship and a container to put it on to ship it west.
Yeah, another thing, so we're talking about the ports, but then once you get it into the ports, you mentioned truck drivers, and there are 60,000 truck driver openings right now that they don't have people for. And then so you say, well, let's just put it on the rail, but there are 6 major rail choke points in the country, and these trains are parked on these side rails, off the beat. And it's I mean, the whole system is, what did you say? Clogged.
Or congested. No, that's right. I mean, the U.S. trucking and trailer shortage and shortage of labor is absolutely exacerbating this. And remember, we started this in Q4 19 when all the major shipping and the FedExes, the UPSs started to charge surcharges. So remember, all of these things, they really started at the end of 2019 in a more limited way.
Yeah, so much of this is described as being related to the COVID-19 pandemic, but that really predates the shutdowns of the pandemic, which happened more towards March, doesn't it? So this is bigger than just the pandemic.
It is. I think that the change is what everybody focused on for so long was last mile, right? And the congestion was in the last mile. Now we're all focused on the first mile. And the last mile has sort of, gotten pushed to the side because, when you look at lead times on goods coming from 2 to 4 months, that's extraordinary. It doesn't matter what the next day, if you're going to get it next day, it may not come for 2 to 4 months. That's the major shift.
Well, and I hear that a lot of folks are, trying to rush key parts in, by renting jumbo jets essentially, but you can't. That's kind of expensive to just rent a jumbo jet and run it through.
It's true. And what clients are telling us is, yes, air freight has always been that solution that you can go to when you have to have the goods now. It's more expensive than, shipping. Having said that, the costs are up 125% over a year ago. So that gets really, really expensive.
Yeah, no, we just heard that the U.S. administration said, well, we've got this thing covered. We've ordered the ports to stay open 7/24. That fix it?
No, I think there's a lack of equipment and a lack of personnel. And I read somewhere, someone compared it as going through Walmart on a Black Friday with one checkout person.
Well, you just walk the stuff out the door. I mean, that's what they do in San Francisco anyway. But that's a whole nother podcast, Cathy. That's a whole different deal. Well, okay, so, these container costs are another issue, aren't they, in supply?
They're extraordinary. And I think like a lot of things we've gone through, tariffs and COVID and now this supply chain issue, it hurts some much more than others. So I think to put it in context, the container costs are multiples of what they used to be. One client said, okay, it used to be $5,000 per container, now it's $20,000. One client said, I have a contract for $1,500 a container, but I've paid up to $24,000 a container during this time. I mean, these are staggering numbers, but what does it mean? Take that same client. What does it mean per item? And this is where it gets really tricky. This is a client that sells an item for $200 at $20,000 a container. He's got to sell that same good at $350 to maintain the margin. So the companies that are really hurt are the big, bulky, lower price point items. It hurts folks like Apple less. Maybe it hurts them. I don't know. I haven't done the math, but maybe it's $1 or $2 a phone. But even Apple said they've lost $6 billion worth of sales because of this.
$6 billion in one company. Well, that's really contributing to inflation. And most economists say, well, and the Fed keeps saying that the inflation is transitory, but it's transitory only. I mean, I don't know what transitory means, a couple months, couple years, couple decades, but it's only transitory if this stuff works through and normalizes. How long do you see that taking?
You mean how long is supply chain and higher costs?
Yeah.
I don't have my crystal ball, but I would certainly like to have that and be able to bet on this. I think a lot of our clients are saying that they really see this, let's talk about the congestion and the delays lasting at least through fall of 2022. Some companies have come out and said, oh, we'll be through this in, spring of 2022. We think it's longer.
Yeah, it has to be because, all the manufacturing for the holiday season, you're a retail expert, so you know this, and I ran retail companies. All the production happens in the winter and spring for the following year, and all the goods have to be ordered by March, April, and everything. The last ship has to leave and be on the water in July in order to get in place in a normal period in order to make it for the holidays. So, you've almost got to be doing this right now for holiday season of 2022.
I don't think we're there yet. The interesting thing I hear from clients is we have plenty of goods coming for holiday. The question is, will they get here in time?
Will they get here? Yeah, no, that's exactly. They're coming. Maybe they'll be there for next year.
Where are they? We don't know.
They're coming. Okay. Well, listen, so far we've talked about the current state of the supply chain. Next, we're going to look at the impact on businesses and what they're doing to deal with it. We're going to take a short break, and I'll be right back.
Interested in this content? You can find this and much more at our Conference Board website, www.conference-board.org. Or, even better, contact our membership team and your company can enjoy the benefits of our in-depth research around the economy, environmental, social, and governance issues, public policy, marketing and communications, and human capital. As a member of the Conference Board, you will be able to have full access to all of our cutting-edge research, leading indicators, benchmarking, and data services, in addition to webcasts and podcasts such as the one you are enjoying now.
Welcome back to CEO Perspectives. I'm your host, Steve Odland, the CEO of the Conference Board, and I'm joined today by the Managing Director and Co-Head of Solomon Partners Global Consumer Retail Group, Cathy Leonhardt. And Cathy is a retail expert. All of her clients are retail, and she talks to CEOs and C-suite members every day about these issues. So Cathy, what do you do? I mean, if you're one of your clients, what are they doing to deal with this and get the goods here?
Well, I think the solutions are challenging given the concentration of the ocean carrier alliances. I think the number is that they control 89 to 90% of the volume. And we talked about air freight as an alternative, but that only goes so far. I think a couple of things. We've seen companies as these supply chain issues, because remember, we're going into year 2 of this in reality, and they began to accelerate and increase their orders to try to compensate for the shipping delays. They knew it was coming, so they accelerated orders. I think some are loading up on inventory, they're carrying far more merchandise they normally would, particularly going into this holiday season. And it's a bit of a logistical nightmare. We've seen that the 2 biggest general merchandise retailers have each upped the amount of goods they're holding, Walmart by 20% and Target by 26%. So you can see what they've done. They've rented other extra warehouse space and they've staged all these goods. It's sort of like this indoor parking lot for all these goods. So it's quite extraordinary. So that's one solution. Order more, accelerate the orders.
But that takes a lot of working capital. In other words, you're tying up a lot of that cash that you didn't have to tie up before. I remember, when I ran retail firms, if a supplier ever shorted me, I just ordered 10 times as much. And then when the supply started coming in and I got the amount I wanted, I started canceling the orders. And that's not the right way to do things. But that's the inefficiency that's going to be created by all of this, right? When they start canceling orders.
I mean, and yes, again, it hurts the little guys. The other thing is for these big retailers, if the product is coming in a choppy way, sometimes they won't take it unless you have the full assortment, depending on the category. So that's also a problem. So I think what you're seeing is, let's talk about brands. And we cover lots of categories from consumables to hard lines to soft lines. The challenge is, so if you have your own channels, you're going to ship there first because big box may shut you down if you don't have all the assortment. Now, that's an interesting, because you're like, I can ship a partial assortment to my store and my online, and that's okay. And I'm not going to get penalized from my wholesale partner.
But, that's an interesting thing, because what you're seeing is that retailers, both online and in stores they're just selling what they have. I mean, you obviously, by definition, you can't sell what you don't have, and you're ending up with all sorts of weird SKUs, so the green sweater that nobody else, I think we're going to have a lot of ugly sweater contests this holiday season as a result, don't you?
I do, but it's got to be better than last year when nobody sold those ugly sweaters and they just carried them over a year. We did see that in the store.
Well, that's why they're still in stock. It's just maybe they'll be fashionable again someday. It is interesting. What about this notion, Cathy, that okay, if everything's stuck on the West Coast, down in LA, can you just forget about sending it to this? I mean, it's November. You're not going to get it to the bricks and mortar stores. Can you just set up a quasi e-com system and ship out of the warehouses there?
I think it's really complicated. I think when you step back and you look at what's happened, I think most of the companies we talked to are going hard after sales, and they're pushing through the increased costs as much, and they've done everything they can to accelerate the product delivery. And if it's not in the right place at the right time, they're doing everything they can do to get it there. But what we've found is that the best in class partners and the best in class, businesses, when they look at supply chain, they've really focused on agility. And so they've done things like move product to a different country of origin. They've literally physically taken the raw materials and moved it. They've leaned on their agents. They've consolidated to their value-added partners so they can give them more value and cut a better deal. And the other thing we've seen that's interesting is, a lot of we think about importing and what's the cost you're looking at. It's FOB. They've shifted how they're doing that. So they've changed it to a DDP. So there's a lot of workings that have gone into getting product here in this season. I think is the trucking shortages. That's going to be that's next week's news. I think you're a little ahead of that. There will be more and more on that because a lot of goods have come despite these bottlenecks.
Right. FOB is free on board to the port. DDP is delivered duty paid. So it's a means of trying to get it there faster. You also talked about, Cathy, people are some of these big folks are renting their own ships. Is that for real?
I think it only works for those who can afford to build their own supply chain, the Walmarts, the Targets, the Home Depots that are chartering ships to bypass these carrier delays. That's a big cost. I think the cost to lease a ship is in the millions.
Yeah, it is huge. So airplane ships, they're borrowing. Next thing we'll have fast boats running up rivers to run it in inland ports.
I mean, they are using different ports. They're picking them up from different ports. They're delivering to different ports. So there's a lot of movement that we don't see. And, what we found is our clients who've really embraced this, right? And it's having the information and the visibility on product and flow. And they speak about it by the second, to coordinate overseas offices, to the sourcing team, to the logistics team, so that the merchant planners and finance teams have the information, to really know what they have and plan this out. But as you said, this working capital, excess working capital, is quite a cash flow use.
Yeah, and the banks are having to line up to provide that financing. I drove through. We talked a lot about the ports in Southern California. I drove through the port of Jacksonville this weekend, and it is jammed with empty containers. I mean, I've never seen it so jammed. So it's and you'd say, well, why don't you just bypass the ports? Well, you got to get it then through the Panama Canal, and there are limitations. And then last year we saw the Suez Canal get jammed. So I mean, they're just only so much capacity in the system and means to go around it. And I think it comes back to your point, which is the stuff's on the way, but are we going to get it there? So what does that mean for holiday sales?
A couple of things. I think longer term, what our clients are seeing that they expect the costs will continue to rise. And so at some point, when you begin to see this price inelasticity, I do think you'll start to see shifting spending patterns. And what does that mean? It means consumers are going to focus their spending more on necessary goods. And we see that when the costs rise. So we do see this period of costs continuing to rise. There's always a silver lining, and what brands and retailers have seen through this period, in COVID, they all trumpeted, hey, we're operating on lower working capital, right? We're more efficient, we're turning faster. But with the supply chain and the shortages, what they're seeing is, first of all, big misses across top line revenues. So I think most companies that have come out with earnings are saying, hey, we missed on the top line. It's going to get pushed out to fourth quarter. But what they're seeing is more profitability. So higher margins, higher profitability, less discounting, and higher prices. Now, the question is, will they have the discipline to continue that sort of behavior? We've got a lot of businesses in our country that are very promotional driven. They're not promoting now because they can't afford to. They don't have the goods.
Yeah. And so if you have fewer goods or less inventory to sell, then what you're saying is they're charging more for those items, because why not? Why give it away when you don't have it? So charge more for it. So you're saying margins are going to go up. But also one of the big factors in margin, as you and I both know, are returns. And, it seems like the returns should be at a record low this year. So that should help margins as well through the holiday season.
I think so. If you buy it, you're clutching it for dear life, so you have a gift to give.
Yeah, exactly. And then clearance is another margin hit usually, and it should be minimized. So maybe from a bottom line standpoint, things will be okay. But the question is long term. Where do we go, and how long does this take? I guess so. So Cathy, you're an investment banker, and you're dealing with clients on transactions and everything else. What do you think the supply chain issues are going to do to your clients long term, and also deal making?
It seems every conversation we have with clients includes a discussion about supply chain. I read that Business Insider cited supply chain was uttered 3,000 times in S&P 500 company earnings this year. So this is a complete shift in company focus. From a deal-making perspective, those who control their own infrastructure or supply chain have a competitive advantage. We talk about it as this is the strategic weapon because, before when you thought about supply chain, that was the thing in the back of the book. The buyers checked the box. It was in the back of the SIM. It was confirmatory. Now it's front and center. It's an important part of valuation, and it's a competitive advantage. And so you're going to see this new focus on supply chain. I think, what does that mean? It's dedicated factories, it's flexibility of manufacturing, it's flexibility of supply chain, some of these other things we've talked about. And the diligence is going to be, how did you get through the supply chain challenges of this year?
So Cathy, last question. There was a strategy for about a decade to move out of supply chain, outsource your supply chain and really go to supply chain light. But those companies, as you said, are at a disadvantage today. So do you see that maybe a whole shift in strategy where companies are going to want to build their own supply chain, own it, control it, or even acquire companies for their supply chain capability?
I do believe that defensibility and consistency of your supply chain are going to be mission critical going forward. It doesn't mean you shift your whole supply chain from overseas to domestically, but having access to different markets and being able to shift it. So I go back to the word agility. I think agility and consistency in your supply chain are going to be mission critical and that's the new element of how buyers are going to evaluate businesses.
That's really fascinating. Cathy Leonhardt, Managing Director of Solomon Partners, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Steve, for having me.
And thanks to all of you for listening in to CEO Perspectives. Every few weeks, I'll be joined by a leader from one of our centers or a business executive to provide insights on the issues of our time. We'll cover leading topics in public policy, environmental, social, and governance, marketing communications, the economy, human capital, and more. Please share CEO Perspectives with your colleagues because I know they're going to want to listen to everything that you've heard. I'm Steve Odland, and this podcast has been brought to you by the Conference Board.
You have been listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.